Part 1. Dust and Solitude. The sun in West Texas was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a physical weight that beat down on the land from a bleached blue sky, cracking the red earth into a map of 1,000 tiny, thirsty canyons. It was the first thing John Carter felt in the morning and the last thing he saw at night. A relentless, indifferent God governing his small kingdom of dust and solitude. His world, circa 1872, was 160 acres of stubbornness carved out of the vast, unforgiving plains that bled into New Mexico. At its heart stood a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, its pine logs baked the color of old bone. A few yards away, a windmill groaned a constant, weary complaint against the wind, its metal blades turning with a rhythmic squeal that had become the only steady voice in John's life. It was the sound of survival, the sound of water being drawn from deep within the earth, a sound more precious than gold. Beyond that, a field of corn stood in brittle, yellowed rows, the stalks rustling like ghosts in the hot breeze, their heads bowed in defeat. John, a man in his late 30s, moved through this world with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who has learned not to waste a single motion. The war had taught him that. Shiloh, Antietam, those places had burned away everything that was unnecessary in him, leaving behind a hard, quiet core. His face was a testament to his life, tanned a deep, leathery brown, with lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. His beard, thick and the color of dried wheat, hid the grim set of his mouth, but his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, held a deep and abiding sorrow that the sun could not touch. He had come out here after Eleanor died. The fever had taken her in a matter of days, leaving him with a silence in his heart that was louder than any cannon fire he'd ever endured. The world of men, with its towns and its talk and its hollow condolences, had become unbearable. So he'd come west, seeking a place where the silence outside matched the silence within. He'd bought the land, built the cabin, and set about the task of living, not out of any joy for it, but out of a dogged refusal to die. His days were a ritual, a litany of chores that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to the graveyard back in Ohio. At dawn, he'd rise, the cool air a brief mercy. He'd fetch water, the squeal of the windmill his morning hymn. He'd check on his horse, a stoic gray gelding named Solomon, whose quiet companionship was the only kind John could tolerate. He'd mend fences, the sharp thud of his hammer echoing in the vast emptiness. He'd work his cornfield, though it was a losing battle against the heat, his sweat stinging his eyes and leaving white salt stains on his dark shirt. There was a pride in it, a silent, unacknowledged satisfaction. Every fence post he set, every bucket of water he drew, was a victory against the wilderness that was always waiting to reclaim its own. This life was harsh, it was lonely, but it was his. He owed nothing to anyone and expected nothing in return. He was the master of his small, dusty patch of creation, a king with no subjects, a priest with no congregation. The midday sun on this particular afternoon was exceptionally cruel. The air shimmered above the baked earth, distorting the horizon into a wavering, watery line. Even the cicadas, usually a deafening chorus, had been beaten into a subdued hum. John was walking the perimeter of his cornfield, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, checking for jackrabbits or any other creature desperate enough to try for his meager crop. He paused to wipe a forearm across his brow, the sweat running in rivulets through the grime on his skin. That's when he saw it. At the far edge of the field, where the cultivated land gave way to scrub and mesquite, was a patch of color that didn't belong. It wasn't the red of the earth or the yellow of the dying corn. It was a small, dark shape, crumpled against the ground. His first thought was a coyote, maybe sick or injured. His body tensed, the old instincts from the war rising to the surface. He moved forward, his steps silent, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. Nothing. just the endless empty plain and the oppressive sky. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a girl, lying face down in the dirt. She was small, dressed in worn buckskin, her long black hair matted with dust and tangled with burrs. One of her moccasins was missing, her bare foot swollen and blistered. John stopped 10 feet away, his knuckles white on the stock of his gun. His mind raced. Comanche. The beadwork on her dress. The style of her hair he'd seen enough during his time as a soldier to know. And a Comanche, this far south and alone, meant one thing: trouble. It meant warriors looking for her. It meant settlers who would see her as a threat, or worse, an opportunity. It meant bringing a war he had tried so desperately to leave behind right to his doorstep. He should turn around, walk back to his cabin, bolt the door, and pretend he'd seen nothing. The plains were full of death. It was the natural order of things. Adding one more small soul to the tally wouldn't change the world. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. He stood there for a long minute, the sun beating on his neck, the silence of the prairie pressing in on him. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her back. She was alive. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp as a shard of glass. Eleanor, in her final hours, her breath a shallow whisper, her hand so small and frail in his. He had been helpless then, a strong man made useless by a force he could not fight, with a curse that was more a prayer. John lowered his shotgun and leaned it against a fence post. He walked forward and knelt beside the girl. He gently, cautiously, turned her over. Her face was young, so young, 14, maybe 15 at most. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked and bleeding. A dark bruise marred one side of her face, and there were scratches on her arms, long and angry, as if she'd clawed her way through thorny brush. She was utterly spent, a fragile vessel emptied of all life save for the faint flutter of her pulse against his fingertips. His heart, a thing he thought had long since turned to stone, gave a painful lurch. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't a warrior. This was a child. "All right, little one," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's get you out of this, son." His movements were surprisingly gentle. He slipped one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and desperation. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and a soft, unconscious moan escaped her lips. The sound was so full of pain and fear that it cut right through him. He carried her back toward the cabin, his long strides eating up the distance. The world seemed to narrow to the small, warm weight in his arms. He was no longer just a farmer, a veteran, a widower. He was a man carrying a life, and the responsibility of it settled on him like a heavy wool blanket. Inside, the cabin was dark and cool, a sanctuary from the relentless glare outside. He laid her on his own narrow cot, the rough spun blanket a stark contrast to her dark skin. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her, a stranger from another world lying in the heart of his solitude. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of another human being, another breath, another heartbeat. Her lips were moving, forming silent words. Thirst, of course. He went to the water bucket, his hands feeling clumsy as he filled a tin dipper. He returned to the cot and knelt, lifting her head carefully with one hand. "Easy now," he whispered. "Just a little." He touched the cool metal rim to her lips. At first, there was no response. Then, her senses seemed to catch the scent of the water. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark, deep, and wild with panic. He saw a flicker of terror as she focused on his face. She tried to pull away, a weak, frantic movement. "Shh, shh," he soothed, his voice low and steady. "It's just water. You're safe." He held the dipper firm. Her thirst warred with her fear, and thirst won. She began to drink, at first in small, hesitant sips, then in desperate, gulping swallows, the water spilling from the corners of her mouth and running down her chin. He let her drink until she coughed and pushed the dipper away, her breathing ragged. She sank back onto the cot, her eyes closing once more, already slipping back into the darkness of exhaustion. John stood up and walked to the stone hearth, the center of his home. He looked around the small, spare room, his rifle mounted above the mantelpiece, his single chair by the fire, his few books on a rough plank shelf. It was a world built for one. And now there were two. He was a fool, a damn fool. He knew what people said about the Comanche. He knew the stories, the fear, the hatred. He knew that a white man found harboring one of them could end up swinging from a cottonwood tree, his farm burned to the ground. This single act of compassion could undo everything he had built, could cost him the one thing he had left his life. But as he looked at the small, still form on his bed, he couldn't find an ounce of regret in his soul. He saw only a child, lost and hurt, who the world had tried to break. He had seen too much of that in the war. He had seen too many good men broken, too much innocence ground into the mud. He had come out here to escape the world of men. But perhaps, he thought with a grim irony, you couldn't escape being a man. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The heat of the day finally began to recede, replaced by the cool breath of the coming night. John took a clean rag and gently washed the dust and dried blood from the girl's face. His calloused fingers surprisingly deft. Her features were fine, delicate, even under the grime and bruising. She didn't stir. As darkness fell, he lit a single lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. He cooked a thin stew of salted pork and beans for himself, eating it slowly while standing by the door, his eyes scanning the darkening plains. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. He pulled his chair close to the hearth and built a small fire, not for warmth, but for the company of its light. The girl was still sleeping, her breathing deeper now, more even. He had covered her with his best wool blanket. The cabin was quiet save for the crackle of the flames and her soft breaths. John sat in his chair, his shotgun resting across his knees, and prepared to wait out the night. He was a farmer, but he had been a soldier first. He knew how to watch. He knew how to listen. Outside, the wind began to rise, a low, mournful sound as it swept across the endless grasslands. It howled around the corners of the cabin, rattling the single glass pane in the window. It sounded like a lament, a warning, a prophecy. Listening to it, John felt a cold dread settle in his gut, a premonition as old as the hills. He had brought a life out of the dust, and now, he feared, the dust would come to claim a debt. The solitude was broken, and something was coming. Part 2. The Stranger in the Cabin. Dawn broke not with a bang, but with a slow bleed of gray light across the eastern plains, pushing back the immense, star-dusted darkness of the Texas night. John had not slept. He had remained in his chair by the hearth, the shotgun heavy on his lap, his senses tuned to the night. He listened to the wind, the distant cry of a lone coyote, and the soft, steady breathing of the girl on his cot. Each breath she took was a small anchor, holding him in the present, keeping the ghosts of his past at bay. When the light was strong enough to cast pale shadows in the cabin, she stirred. A small sound, a sigh that caught in her throat, brought John's head up. He watched as she slowly sat up, her movement stiff and cautious, her eyes, wide and dark, took in the strange surroundings, the log walls, the stone hearth, the unfamiliar scent of wood smoke and coffee. When her gaze finally landed on him, the fear returned in a tidal wave, wiping away the grogginess of sleep. She flinched back against the wall, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin like a shield. John held up a hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace he'd learned long ago was worth more than a dozen languages. He kept his voice low, the same tone he used to soothe a spooked horse. "Easy now. You're safe." He stood up slowly, setting the shotgun aside, leaning it against the wall where she could see it was no immediate threat. He moved to the small cast-iron stove and poured a cup of the chicory coffee he'd been keeping warm. He didn't have much else to offer. He took a piece of day-old cornbread, broke it in half, and set it on a tin plate. He approached the cot as one might approach a wild fawn, holding the plate out to her. She stared at the food, then at him, her mind clearly torn between hunger and suspicion. He knelt down a few feet away, placing the plate on the floor between them, and then retreated to his chair. He would not crowd her. He would let her make the choice. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, her hunger won. With her eyes still locked on him, she reached out a trembling hand and took the cornbread. She ate it in small, ravenous bites, her gaze never leaving his face. He saw then that the bruise on her cheek was darker this morning, a violent purple against her skin. The scratches on her arms looked raw and inflamed. When she was done, he spoke again, softly. "Water," he pointed to the bucket. She understood. She gave a short, jerky nod. He brought her the dipper, and this time she took it from him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a spark, a reminder of the living, breathing reality of the person before him. She drank deeply, her throat working. Communication was a wall between them, but he had to try. He pointed to his own chest. "John," he repeated it. "John." She watched his lips, her expression a mixture of confusion and concentration. He pointed to her. "You?" She looked down at her hands, then back at him. She spoke for the first time, her voice a soft, husky whisper, fragile as a dry leaf. "Ayana." The name was beautiful, foreign and musical in the quiet cabin. It felt like a gift, a secret shared. "Ayana," he repeated, testing the sound of it. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps relief passed over her face. She had been heard. John remembered a few words of the Numunu language from his time on the frontier with the army. They were mostly harsh words, words of command and conflict. But he sifted through his memory for the gentler ones. He pointed to her wounds. "Hurt." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. She nodded. A single, sharp movement. She touched the bruise on her face, then pointed out towards the plains, a gesture of pursuit. "Who?" he asked, his voice hardening despite himself. "Who hurt you?" She began to rock back and forth, a low keening sound escaping her lips. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to make herself smaller. Then she whispered a single word, a name that was a hiss of fear and hatred. "Navajo." The word hung in the air like smoke. Navajo? It made no sense. The Navajo were far to the west, in their own territory. What would they be doing here? Chasing a lone Comanche girl? But the terror in her eyes was real, undeniable. She wasn't lying. John felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. This was deeper and more dangerous than he had imagined. He wanted to ask more, but he could see that she was on the verge of breaking. He backed away, giving her space. "No Navajo here," he said, hoping the simple words could offer some comfort. "You are safe here, Ayana." He spent the rest of the morning tending to his chores, moving with a deliberate slowness so as not to startle her. He left the cabin door open, letting the sunlight spill across the floorboards. He wanted her to see that she wasn't a prisoner. She remained on the cot, watching his every move, a silent observer in his solitary world. Around noon, he heard the sound he had been subconsciously dreading, the steady rhythm of an approaching horse. It wasn't the sound of a war party. It was the heavy, confident tread of an American horse ridden by a white man. John stepped outside, his face grim. He knew who it would be. Jake Harlow reined in his big roan about 20 yards from the cabin, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Harlow was John's only neighbor. If you could call a man whose land started 5 miles away a neighbor, he was a cattleman, broad and sunburned, with a mean squint and a mouth that was permanently downturned. He saw the world in terms of profit and loss, and he considered anything that wasn't a cow or a dollar to be a nuisance. "Carter," Harlow grunted by way of greeting, his eyes sweeping over the farm with a critical air. "Figured I'd see if you was still alive out here. Windmill's making a hell of a racket." "It's been dry, Jake," John replied, his tone even. He stood his ground, not inviting the man any closer. Harlow spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. His gaze was sharp, missing nothing. He looked from John's tense posture to the open cabin door behind him. "You got company?" "Just myself." "Funny," Harlow said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "From my ridge. Thought I saw 2 shadows past that window this morning. One of 'em a good bit smaller than you." John's jaw tightened. "The sun plays tricks out here." Harlow's eyes narrowed into slits. He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He walked closer, his suspicion a palpable thing. He sniffed the air. "Something's different. You ain't the type for visitors." He took another step, craning his neck to peer past John into the cabin's dark interior. From inside, there was a tiny, involuntary sound, a gasp of fear as Ayanna likely saw the imposing figure of the stranger. It was all Harlow needed. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he sneered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "Don't tell me you finally went and bought yourself one of them squaws." "Carter, I knew this loneliness would get to a man eventually." John's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "Get off my land, Jake!" "Oh, I'm going," Harlow said, backing towards his horse, his eyes glinting with malice. "But you ought to know what you're doing. That's a Comanche girl, ain't it? I know the look. You're a bigger fool than I thought." He swung himself up into the saddle. "You think you're doing a good thing. You think you're some kind of saint. Let me tell you what you are. You're a target." He leaned down, his voice low and venomous. "Word gets out you're harboring one of 'em, and every buck looking for her is going to come here first. And when they do, you think they're going to stop and ask questions, they'll burn you out. Or maybe some of our own boys will hear about it. They ain't going to be too pleased you're siding with a savage over your own kind." He straightened up, gathering his reins. "They'll come for you. John," he said, the words falling like stones. "You just brought war to your door." With a final, contemptuous glare, Harlow spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and a heavy, poisonous silence in his wake. John stood there long after Harlow was gone, the man's words echoing in his head. "You just brought war to your door." He had known it, of course. He had felt it in his bones from the moment he'd lifted the girl from the dirt. But hearing it spoken aloud, by a man like Harlow, made it terrifyingly real. He turned and went back inside, shutting the heavy plank door and sliding the thick wooden bolt into place. The sound was loud and final in the small cabin. Ayanna was huddled in the farthest corner of the cot, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes wide with a terror that now had a new, immediate cause. John walked to the hearth and stared into the cold ashes. Harlow was right. He was a fool. He was risking everything: his farm, his life, the peaceful solitude he had sacrificed so much to find for a stranger. A child from a people his own had fought and killed. The safe thing, the logical thing, would be to take her away, leave her somewhere near a water source, far from his land, and let fate decide the rest. It would be cruel, but it would be survival. He thought of Eleanor, of the promise he had failed to keep to protect her, to keep her safe. He had failed then. He looked over at the girl, so small and broken, a piece of driftwood tossed up on his shore by a merciless storm. If he cast her back into that storm, what kind of man would he be? Would there be anything left of him worth saving? He picked up a log and placed it on the embers. He knelt and gently blew on them, coaxing a small flame to life. The fire grew, its warmth pushing back the chill that had settled in his heart. The hearth was the center of the home, a place of warmth and safety. But its smoke would rise from the chimney, a thin gray line against the vast blue sky, a signal, a beacon. It was both a comfort and a danger. It was a choice. He had made his choice when he lifted her from the dust. He had made it when he gave her a name. He was just now admitting it to himself. He spent the rest of the day in a quiet flurry of activity, preparing for a siege that might never come. He checked his rifle, cleaning and oiling it with practiced hands. He counted his cartridges. He reinforced the bolt on the door. He wasn't preparing for war, not really. He was preparing to defend a life. His actions were a wordless promise to the girl who watched him from the shadows of the cot. As evening fell, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. John had made a simple meal of stew, and Ayanna had eaten it, her initial fear giving way to a weary, watchful trust. Now, she was standing by the single window, her small frame silhouetted against the deep crimson of the sunset. The light caught the edges of her black hair, creating a fiery halo. John sat at his small table, cleaning a knife, pretending not to watch her. She was looking out at the endless plains, the world that had hurt her, the world she had fled. Then she began to sing. It wasn't a song in the way he knew songs. It was a low, quiet humming, a melody that rose and fell with the cadence of the wind. It was a sound that seemed born of the prairie itself, full of sorrow and space, and a resilience that broke his heart. It was the sound of a spirit that had not been crushed, a blossom that had refused to wilt in the killing sun. He stopped what he was doing, his hands still. He sat in the growing twilight and just listened. The song wove its way into the cracks of his broken soul, into the empty spaces that Eleanor's death had left behind. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief or the dull ache of survival. It was a feeling he thought had been buried with his wife, a feeling so foreign and yet so familiar it made his throat tighten. It was a fierce, protective tenderness, a feeling of profound, unselfish compassion. It was the return of his own humanity. He looked at the girl by the window, a stranger who had brought war to his door, and he knew, with a certainty that silenced all fear, that he would die before he let anyone hurt her again. Part 3. Echoes of the Plains. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, a quiet dance of two solitary people learning to share the same small space. The immediate terror that had clung to Ayanna like a second skin began to recede, replaced by a watchful, tentative calm. The world outside the cabin, however, did not share their peace. The threat Jake Harlow had promised felt like a physical presence, a tightening in the air, a shadow on the horizon that never quite disappeared. John became a student of the earth in a way he hadn't been since his scouting days in the war. Every morning, with the rising sun at his back, he would walk the perimeter of his land, and he began to find things. The first was a set of hoof prints, discovered in a patch of soft dirt near the dry creek bed. They were small, neat, and unshod the tracks of an Indian pony. They were a day old, maybe 2. He followed them until they vanished on the hard, rocky ground, his hand resting on the worn stock of his shotgun. He couldn't know if they belonged to friend or foe, to the pursuers or the pursued, and that uncertainty was a constant, low-grade fever in his blood. The nights grew louder. The familiar yip of coyotes was now punctuated by a different sound, a long, drawn-out call that was too disciplined, too resonant to be animal. It would come from the north one night, the west the next, an echo that traveled on the wind, a question without an answer. John would stand in the darkness of his doorway, listening, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a signal? A search party? He felt like a man living on a brittle sheet of ice, hearing the cracks spread slowly beneath his feet. Inside the cabin, life took on a new shape. John knew that idleness was a poison for a mind haunted by fear. He began to give Ayanna small tasks, not to make a servant of her, but to give her hands a purpose, to root her in the simple, grounding reality of the farm. He showed her how to work the hand pump, his large, calloused hands guiding her smaller ones on the iron handle. At first, she was clumsy, her movements jerky and uncertain, but she was a quick study. Soon, the rhythmic squeak of the pump became a familiar sound, a joint effort against the thirst of the land. He took her to the withered cornfield. There wasn't much worth salvaging, but he showed her how to pull the dry, shriveled ears from the stalks, a meager harvest against the coming winter. They worked in silence, the rustle of the dead leaves the only conversation. But in these shared, simple acts, a language began to form between them, one built on gesture and mutual effort. When he passed her the water canteen, she would meet his eyes for a moment, a flicker of gratitude in their dark depths. When she stumbled, he would steady her with a hand on her arm, a brief, solid touch that spoke more than words ever could. One afternoon, while mending a broken latch on the stable door, a small miracle occurred. Solomon, his placid gray gelding, nudged Ayanna's shoulder with his nose, looking for a treat. She started, then reached out a hesitant hand to stroke his soft muzzle. A slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. It was the first time John had seen it, and it was like watching the sun break through a week of storm clouds. It transformed her, chasing away the shadows of fear and exhaustion, revealing the child she was beneath the layers of trauma. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, and he had to turn away, a sudden tightness in his throat. Their world was small, but within it, they found moments of profound, unspoken connection. In the evenings, as the sun sank in a spectacular blaze of orange and red, they would often stand by the fence that marked the edge of his property. The dying light would set the prairie dust ablaze, turning the air to gold. It would catch in Ayanna's long, black hair, weaving threads of fire through the darkness. On one such evening, watching the light play across her features as she stared out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land, a thought came to John, unbidden and clear. It looked like the prairie itself had found a way to smile again. The girl's presence began to unearth parts of him he thought were long buried. He found himself speaking, his voice filling the silence he had once cultivated. He told her about the farm, about the stubbornness of the soil, the fickleness of the rain. He knew she understood only a fraction of the words, but she listened with an unwavering intensity. Her head tilted, her eyes fixed on his. It was the act of speaking, of sharing, that mattered. One night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, he found himself pulling a small, worn daguerreotype from his saddlebag. It was his only picture of Eleanor, a faded image of a smiling woman with kind eyes. He held it in his palm, the silver plate cool against his skin. "This was my wife," he said, his voice thick. "Eleanor." He handed the picture to Ayanna. She took it gently, her fingertips tracing the edge of the frame. She looked from the woman in the picture to John, and in her gaze, he saw a deep, intuitive understanding. She couldn't know the story, but she recognized the shape of loss. "Sick," John said, touching his own chest. "After the war." He didn't have the words to explain the fever, the helplessness, the way the world had crumbled to ash around him. But as he spoke, he felt a small, painful loosening in his chest, as if a tightly bound knot had been eased, just a fraction. He was giving his grief a witness, and it made the burden, for the first time, feel infinitesimally lighter. Ayanna handed the picture back to him, her expression soft with a sympathy that needed no language. But this slow thawing of his soul terrified him. To care for this girl was to open himself up to pain again. Grief, he had discovered, was a form of armor. Its cold, heavy weight had protected him, deadened him. He had learned to live with its familiar ache. Now, a new feeling was taking root in his heart, a fierce, protective affection for Ayanna, and it made him feel raw, exposed, and terribly vulnerable. To love something, anything, was to give fate a hostage. He was afraid he was making a terrible mistake, not just in the act of saving her, but in the far more dangerous act of letting his own heart begin to beat again. What would he do if he lost this? 2. The thought was a cold spike of fear that often kept him awake long after Ayanna had fallen asleep. The tension that coiled around the farm finally snapped one moonless night. The wind was high, shrieking around the cabin like a lost soul, and the distant, howling calls had returned, seeming closer this time. John was dozing fitfully in his chair, the rifle across his lap, when a sound from the cot ripped him from his light sleep. It was a cry, small and choked, followed by a frantic babbling in her own tongue. Ayanna was thrashing in her sleep, her hands batting at unseen enemies, her body rigid with fear. She was caught in a nightmare, reliving the terror that had driven her into his field. "Navajo! No, please!" The words were interspersed with sobs that tore at his heart. He was by her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. "Ayanna," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Wake up. You're dreaming." Her eyes flew open, but they were wide and unseeing, still trapped in the horror. She saw his shape looming over her in the dim firelight and let out a scream, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. She scrambled away from him, pressing herself into the corner where the log walls met. "It's me, child. It's John," he said, keeping his voice calm, holding his hands out where she could see them. "You're safe. It was only a dream." The sound of his voice, the familiar tone, seemed to slowly penetrate her panic. Her frantic breathing began to slow. Her wild eyes started to focus. She saw him, really saw him, and the terror in her face crumbled into a desperate, heart-wrenching sorrow. Her composure, the quiet strength she had shown for days, shattered completely. With a sob that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, she launched herself off the cot and into his arms, burying her face against his chest. Her small body shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. She clung to him with the desperation of a drowning person, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his shirt. John froze for a moment, his arms hovering uncertainly. The last person he had held this way was Eleanor. The warmth of another body pressed against his, the feeling of another's tears soaking his shirt, was an intimacy so foreign and so deeply missed that it sent a shockwave through his system. Then his instincts took over. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, holding her tight. One hand cradled the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her long hair, while the other rested on her back, feeling the frantic beating of her heart. "Shh, you're all right," he murmured into her hair, the words a useless but necessary comfort. "You're safe now. I've got you." He held her as she cried, her fear and grief pouring out of her in a cleansing, terrible flood. He stood there in the middle of his silent cabin, a solitary farmer under a vast, dark sky, holding a lost child. He held her like a father holds a daughter, shielding her from the monsters of the night. And he held her like a lonely man holds onto a memory, trying to forget the crushing emptiness of a world without warmth, a life without purpose. In that long, dark moment, surrounded by the echoes of the plains, it was no longer clear who was saving whom. Part 4. The Coming Storm. Word travels fast in a land with few people to carry it. It moves like a prairie fire, jumping from one lonely homestead to the next on whispers and suspicions. Jake Harlow had lit the match, and now the rumor was spreading the farmers harboring an Indian girl. John could feel the change in the air. The vast emptiness that had once been a comfort now felt like a stage, and he was the unwilling actor at its center, watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. A rider on the horizon was no longer a simple traveler, but a potential threat. The silence between gusts of wind was no longer peaceful. It was a void waiting to be filled with violence. The waiting ended a week after Harlow's first visit. John was splitting firewood near the cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe a defiant sound against the quiet plains. When he saw the dust cloud, it was too large for a single rider. 3 of them, coming straight for his farm. He didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. He calmly finished splitting the log in front of him, set the axe down, and wiped his hands on his trousers. He walked into the cabin. Ayanna was grinding corn with a smooth stone, her movements practiced and serene. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately sensing the change in him. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and even. "Bolt the door behind me. Do not open it, for anyone." She nodded, her face paling, the stone still in her hand. He took his shotgun from its mount above the fireplace, checked the load, and walked back outside. Pulling the heavy door shut behind him, he heard the solid thunk of the wooden bolt sliding into place. He stood on his porch, the shotgun held loosely at his side, and waited. Jake Harlow rode in the lead, flanked by 2 men John recognized from the distant trading post. One was a wiry, rat-faced man named Silas, known for his quick temper and cruelty to animals. The other was a heavy-set man called Hank, whose dull eyes and slack jaw suggested a mind that followed orders without question. They were hunters, men who lived by the gun and saw the world as something to be trapped, skinned, or shot. They reined in their horses, forming a half-circle in front of his cabin, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and greed. "Morning, John," Harlow said, his tone thick with false pleasantry. "Fine day for it." "State your business, Jake," John said, his gaze flat and cold. "Business is exactly what we're here for," Harlow replied, gesturing with his thumb toward the cabin. "Word is you came into some property that might fetch a good price down at the fort. The Army pays a decent bounty for strays." "There's no property here," John said, "only what's mine, and a guest." Silas let out a wheezing laugh. "A guest? You hear that, Jake? He calls the little savage a guest." "We know she's in there. Carter," Harlow said, his smile vanishing. "We're not here to ask. We're here to collect. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way. Nobody has to get hurt." "You're not touching her," John said. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding weight of a mountain. "You and your friends have about 10 seconds to get on your horses and ride off my land before this stops being a conversation." Harlow's face darkened with rage. "You're one man, Carter, a crazy, washed-up soldier hiding from the world. We're 3. Don't be a fool." He started to dismount. That was the mistake. The moment Harlow's foot left the stirrup, John moved. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a soldier. He crossed the 10 feet between them in 3 long strides. Before Harlow could even draw the pistol at his hip, John slammed the butt of his shotgun upward, catching the bigger man under the chin. Harlow's head snapped back with a sickening crack of teeth, and he staggered backward, dazed. Silas, quicker than his hulking companion, lunged at John from the side, a long skinning knife in his hand. John pivoted, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and brought the barrel of the shotgun down hard across his wrist. Silas screamed as the bone snapped, the knife clattering into the dust. Hank, meanwhile, had finally managed to climb down from his horse. He charged John like a bull, his head down. John had no room to bring the shotgun to bear. He dropped it and met the charge, the impact driving the air from his lungs. They crashed against the cabin wall, the logs groaning under their combined weight. Hank was strong, his big hands grabbing for John's throat. John drove his knee hard into the man's gut. Once, twice. Hank grunted, his grip loosening. John locked his hands together and brought them down like a hammer on the back of the man's thick neck. The big man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. It was over in less than a minute. John stood breathing heavily, his chest heaving. Silas was on his knees, cradling his broken wrist and cursing. Harlow was spitting blood into the dust, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. John felt a sharp, burning pain in his left forearm. He looked down and saw a long, deep gash where Silas's knife had caught him as he fell. He picked up his shotgun and leveled it at Harlow. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice a low growl. "Now you're going to get your friends, and you're going to get off my land, and if I ever see your face again, I will kill you. That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact." Harlow stared down the twin barrels of the shotgun, and for the first time, he saw the man John had been in the war. The look in John's eyes was not anger. It was a cold, empty promise of violence. Harlow scrambled to his feet, helped the whimpering Silas onto his horse, and then managed to haul Hank's dead weight onto his own. He gave John one last look of pure hatred before riding away, leaving a trail of dust and blood behind them. John stood there until they were a speck on the horizon. Only then did the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a deep, throbbing pain in his arm. He retrieved the skinning knife from the dust and went back inside, bolting the door behind him. Ayanna was pressed against the far wall, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with what he had done. She looked from his bleeding arm to his face, a new and complex emotion dawning in her expression: awe, fear, and a fierce, profound gratitude. Later that evening, the reality of the day settled in. John sat at the table while Ayanna, with a surprising gentleness, cleaned the gash on his arm with a wet rag. He had found signs that morning: a single, black-tipped feather, the kind used by Navajo fletchers, caught on a mesquite bush a half-mile away. The danger wasn't just from men like Harlow. It was from the very people Ayanna had fled. He was caught between two fires. The lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light in the small cabin, creating an island of peace in a sea of darkness. The shared violence, the blood he had shed for her, had broken the last of the walls between them. Seeing his wound, she finally began to speak. Her story came out in a painful, halting torrent, a mixture of her own tongue, the few English words she knew, and expressive, desperate gestures. She pointed to herself. "Comanche," she said, a word filled with pride and sorrow. She made the shape of a camp, of families, of dancing. Then her face darkened. She made the shape of men on horses, swift and silent. She whispered the word again, the hiss of a snake. "Navajo!" She pantomimed being captured, her hands tied, being dragged away from her home. She spoke of a long, terrible journey, of fear and hunger. Then she showed him how she had escaped. A moment of carelessness from her captors, a knife used to cut her ropes, a desperate flight into the night, running until her feet were raw and her lungs burned, until she had finally collapsed at the edge of his field. John listened, his heart aching with every broken word, every pained gesture. He finally understood. She wasn't just a lost girl, she was a survivor, a refugee from a conflict he knew nothing about. As she finished her story, a low rumble echoed in the distance. A cool breeze whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls. John looked out the window. The sky to the west was a wall of bruised, purple clouds, lit from within by silent flashes of lightning. A storm was coming. "The horse," John said, more to himself than to her. "Need to check on Solomon." He pulled on his coat and unbolted the door. The wind hit him with force, carrying the smell of rain and wet earth. Ayanna hesitated for a moment, then followed him out into the churning twilight. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as they reached the stable. By the time they were inside, the heavens had opened. Rain fell in a solid, deafening sheet, drumming on the wooden roof like 1,000 frantic fists. It was a deluge, a force of nature that seemed intent on washing the world clean. Inside the stable, the air was warm and smelled of hay and horse. Solomon nickered softly, shifting in his stall. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting long, dancing shadows. Lightning flashed, and for a second the world outside was lit in a stark, ghostly white, followed by a deafening crash of thunder that shook the very ground. Ayanna flinched, and John instinctively put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the storm rage. The rain was a curtain, cutting them off from the rest of the world, enclosing them in their small, fragile sanctuary. The relentless, violent sound washed away the echoes of the fight, the whispers of rumor, the fear of what was to come. It was a baptism by water and wind, a cleansing of fear and solitude. In the dim, flickering light, their breaths mingled in the cool air. It was a moment of pure, unadorned human connection. Two souls sheltering together against a storm that was both outside and within. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The roar of the rain softened to a steady drumming, then to a gentle patter, and finally to a dripping silence. A profound quiet fell over the plains, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet soil and new life. For a moment, there was only peace. And then a new sound cut through the night. It was faint at first, a rhythmic squelching from the muddy ground, but it grew steadily louder, more defined. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse or even three. It was the sound of many horses, moving with a quiet, deliberate purpose. They were close, terribly close. John's hand went to the pistol at his belt. He exchanged a look with Ayanna in the lantern light. Her eyes were wide, her face a mask of dawning horror. The peace was shattered. The brief sanctuary was gone. The enemy was here. Part V Navajo at dawn. The night was a long, suffocating vigil. John and Ayanna did not return to the cabin. They remained in the deep shadows of the stable. The scent of hay and damp earth a strange comfort against the terror that lay just outside. The sound of the horses had stopped, but the presence of their riders was a palpable thing, a weight on the air that was heavier than the storm had ever been. There were no voices, no fires, just a silent, disciplined occupation of the darkness that surrounded his small farm. John, a soldier once more, knew what it was. They had established a perimeter. They were waiting for the light. He stood by the stable door, peering through a narrow crack, his shotgun held at a low ready, his mind honed by the brutal calculus of war, assessed his position. One man, one girl, a sturdy log cabin, a wooden stable, one rifle, one shotgun, a pistol, perhaps 50 rounds in total. Against them, an unknown number of hostiles? 10 20 more. The odds were not just poor. They were non-existent. A frontal assault would be suicide. A defensive stand would be a protracted execution. Beside him, Ayanna was a statue carved from fear. She had not cried or made a sound since the hoofbeats had stopped. She simply stood, her eyes fixed on the same crack in the door, her breathing shallow. In the darkness, he could feel the tremors that ran through her small body. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. The touch was an anchor for them both in a sea of dread. There was no plan that ended with them alive, not with guns. He knew this with a cold, clear certainty. He could perhaps take a few of them with him, a final act of bloody defiance, but they would pour over his defenses like water through a sieve. They would get to the cabin, to the stable. They would get to her. And the thought of what would happen to her in the final. Violent moments made his blood run cold, as the first hint of gray began to dilute the blackness of the eastern sky. A new kind of clarity settled over him. His military training screamed at him to prepare, to make every shot count, to turn his farm into a fortress. But another voice, one he had not heard in a long time, the voice of the man he had been before the war. The man who had loved Eleanor. The man who had pulled this child from the dust spoke of a different path. Violence was a language he knew well, but it was a language of endings. He was searching, desperately, for a language of beginnings. The dawn arrived not as a gentle promise, but as a stark revelation. A thin line of fiery orange appeared on the horizon, spreading upwards, pushing back the night. The light crept across the rain-soaked plains, catching on the puddles and turning them to pools of liquid copper. And with the light came the truth. John pushed the stable door open a few inches more and looked out. His breath caught in his chest. They were everywhere. A silent, motionless ring of warriors encircled his property. They sat astride their ponies, which stood with heads bowed, their coats still damp from the storm. John counted 10, 20, at least 30 of them. They were not a rabble. They were a war party, disciplined and grim. The rising sun glinted off the tips of their lances and the barrels of their rifles. Feathers in their hair, black-tipped eagle feathers, stirred in the cool morning breeze. Their faces, stark and impassive, were turned towards the cabin. Some bore the subtle markings of war paint, black and white lines that accentuated the hard set of their jaws. They were not raiders. They were judges. This was the moment, the final act. He could stay in the stable, try to fight from cover, or he could face them. He looked down at Ayanna. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with the terror she had been running from. "It will be all right," he said, the words feeling thin and hollow even to his own ears. He took a deep breath, the cold, clean air a shock to his lungs. He leaned his shotgun against the stable wall. He unbuckled his gun belt, the one holding his pistol, and let it fall to the hay-strewn floor. He was a farmer, nothing more. He looked at Ayanna and nodded towards the cabin. "Stay here," he whispered. Then he turned, stepped out of the stable, and began to walk into the open. Every nerve in his body screamed in protest. It was a walk into the mouth of a cannon, a deliberate stride towards his own end. The ground was soft and muddy under his boots. The air was cold on his face. He kept his hands open and away from his body, his palms facing forward. He did not look at any single warrior, but kept his gaze steady, fixed on the space between two riders who seemed to form the center of the line. He stopped in the middle of the yard, halfway between his cabin and the silent arc of horsemen. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the dripping of water from the roof of the porch and the soft snort of a nearby pony. He was one man, unarmed, his shirt stained with his own dried blood from the fight with Harlow, standing in a circle of death. He had offered no threat. He had made no plea. He simply stood, a testament to his choice. The bolt on the cabin door scraped back, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. John's heart sank. "No, child, I told you to stay put." The door creaked open, and Ayanna stepped out onto the porch. She was trembling so hard he could see it from 50 feet away. Her face was a mask of terror, but her back was straight. Her chin was held high. She walked down the 2 steps and came to stand beside him, her small shoulder brushing against his wounded arm. She had made her choice, too. She would not hide while the man who had saved her faced her demons alone. This was the scene, the image that would be burned into his memory for whatever time he had left. The lone farmer and the Comanche girl, standing together under a vast crimson sky, surrounded by Navajo warriors at dawn. The first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, and the world was bathed in a brilliant, bloody light. It shone on the earnest fear in the girl's eyes and the weary resolve in the farmer's. It gleamed on the dark, unreadable faces of the warriors, on the polished wood of their rifle stocks, on the sharp, deadly points of their lances. From the center of the line, one rider moved forward. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder battles. His hair was streaked with gray, and a single eagle feather was tied into his long braid. He wore no paint, but his presence was more commanding than any of the younger, more decorated warriors. He radiated an authority that was absolute. He reined in his pony 10 feet from them. his dark eyes moving from John's unarmed posture to the fierce, frightened girl at his side. This was their chief. John knew this was the precipice. One wrong move, one sign of fear or aggression, and it would all be over. He kept his hands open, his stance relaxed. He met the chief's gaze directly. Holding it, he was trying to communicate the only thing he could, I mean no harm. Then Ayanna did something that stunned him. She stepped forward, away from the protective shadow of his body. She walked slowly towards the chief, her eyes never leaving his face. When she was just a few feet from his horse, she dropped to her knees in the wet, red mud. She bowed her head and began to speak. Her voice, trembling at first, grew stronger as she spoke. She used her own tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels that the wind seemed to carry directly to the chief. John could not understand the words, but he understood the story. He saw it in her hands, which moved with a desperate eloquence. She pointed to John, then touched her own lips, mimicking the act of drinking water. She pointed to his cabin, a place of shelter. She pointed to his wounded arm, then made a gesture of fighting, of driving something away. She was telling him everything. She was pleading for his life. The chief listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not look at her, but kept his eyes locked on John. He was weighing the girl's words against the man's presence. He was reading John's soul. When she finished, a heavy, absolute silence fell once more. Ayanna remained kneeling in the mud, her head bowed, the tension stretched, becoming a thin, sharp wire that vibrated with the promise of violence. A warrior to the left shifted his weight, and the leather of his saddle creaked. The sound was like a gunshot. John's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the judgment. The chief's gaze did not waver from John's. For a long, eternal moment, the fate of the small, dusty farm and the two souls within it rested in the dark, steady eyes of this man. He had seen 1,000 white men. He had seen their greed, their lies, their treaties written in disappearing ink. He had every reason to believe John was another one, a man who had taken the girl for his own purposes. But he had also seen the way John stood, unarmed and unafraid. He had seen the way the girl stood with him, a defiant act of loyalty. He had heard the truth in her desperate plea. Finally, with a movement so subtle it was almost missed, the chief gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He raised his right hand, palm open, and then slowly lowered it. Across the yard, the change was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a string had been cut. Lances were lowered, their sharp points dipping towards the earth. Rifles were eased back into scabbards. The tension that had held 30 men rigid and ready for death simply dissolved, flowing out of them and into the muddy ground. The warriors relaxed in their saddles, their expressions shifting from grim anticipation to a weary, watchful curiosity. The war was over. Ayanna looked up, her face streaked with mud and tears. She saw the lowered weapons, and a choked sob of relief escaped her. John let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for an eternity. He felt a wave of lightheadedness wash over him, his knees suddenly weak. He had faced death on the battlefield, surrounded by the screams of men and the roar of cannons. But he had never, in his entire life, felt as close to the edge as he had in the profound silence of that Texas dawn. He had gambled everything he had not on the strength of his arm or the accuracy of his aim, but on the simple, fragile hope that a bridge of trust could be built between two worlds. Even in a circle of spears, and against all odds, he had won. Part 6. The Bridge Between Worlds. The chief, Hastian, swung a leg over his pony and dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. His moccasins made soft, sucking sounds in the mud as he walked towards them. He did not look at Ayanna, still kneeling in the dirt, but kept his gaze fixed on John. John, in turn, moved to Ayanna's side and gently placed a hand on her arm, helping her to her feet. The simple, protective gesture did not go unnoticed by the warriors who watched, their faces still like stone but their eyes missing nothing. When Hastian stopped before them, he was close enough for John to see the fine lines around his eyes, the deep scar that cut through one eyebrow. His face was a history of the harsh sun and the hard wind. He was not a young man, but there was an immense, unyielding strength in his posture. He looked at John. Then his gaze dropped to Ayanna, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than stern judgment entered his expression. It was a deep, weary sadness. He spoke, his voice low and gravelly. The words in his own tongue. Ayanna, her face streaked with mud, looked up at John, her role as a terrified victim shifting to that of a vital interpreter. "He says, 'Thank you,'" she whispered, her English words faltering. "He says the spirit of the dying thanks you for my life." John simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. An entire war party had come to his door, not for vengeance, but for gratitude. The thought was so staggering, so contrary to every instinct that had screamed at him for the past 12 hours, that he felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world had tilted on its axis. With a gesture from their chief, 4 other warriors dismounted and joined him. The rest remained on their ponies, a silent, watchful circle. John knew a gesture of trust was required, one that would match the chief's act of lowering his weapons. He turned and gestured toward his cabin. "My house," he said, looking at Ayanna, then at Hastian. "Please, come in." Ayanna translated, her voice gaining a little more confidence. Hastian studied John's face for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. He and his 4 warriors followed John across the muddy yard and onto the porch. Before entering, they paused, their eyes taking in the humble dwelling. It was a place built by a single man, a place of solitude, and they seemed to respect the quiet strength of its construction. Inside, the cabin felt crowded, charged with the energy of these powerful men. They moved with a silent, deliberate grace, their presence filling the small space. They smelled of rain, leather, and wood smoke. Ayanna stood close to John, her body still trembling slightly, the bridge between these 2 disparate worlds. John gestured to his single chair and the rough-hewn bench by the hearth. Hastian took a seat by the fire, his men standing respectfully behind him. Ayanna remained standing, ready to translate. Through her, the story finally unspooled, solving the riddle that had tormented John for days. Hastian explained that the men who had taken Ayanna were not warriors. They were outcasts, renegades, a small band of Navajo who had brought dishonor to their people. They were what his people called coyotes, men who preyed on the weak, who stole and traded for personal gain, answering to no law but their own greed. They had been raiding isolated camps, Comanche and Apache alike, taking women and children to sell to unscrupulous white traders near the Mexican border. Hastian's clan had been tracking them for weeks, ever since they had received word from a Comanche chief about the attack on a hunting party. 3 children had been taken. Ayanna, he explained, was the only one they knew of who had managed to escape. Her flight had led them here, to this small, lonely farm in the middle of nowhere. When they had seen the smoke from his chimney, they had feared the worst, that he was one of the traders, that Ayanna had simply been passed from one captor to another. As John listened, the pieces fell into place. The fear in Ayanna's eyes at the word Navajo was not born of tribal hatred, but of a specific, personal terror. The men who had hurt her wore the faces of her pursuers. When the chief finished speaking, a heavy silence filled the cabin. John looked at these men, at their hard, weary faces, and saw not enemies but lawmen. He saw fathers and brothers engaged in a desperate search, a grim duty to reclaim their own honor by hunting down those who had none. He knew he had to offer them something. Hospitality was a sacred law on the plains, and these men were now, improbably, his guests. He had so little, He went to his cupboard and took out the last of his cornbread and a piece of dried venison. He set it on the table. Then he went to the water bucket, the one he and Ayanna had filled together, and ladled fresh, cool water into a tin cup. He offered the food and water to Hastian first. The chief accepted it with a nod, breaking off a piece of the bread and eating it slowly, thoughtfully. He passed the rest to his men. It was a poor feast, but it was given freely, an offering from one man who understood hardship to others. Hastian's eyes scanned the small cabin. Taking in the details of John's life, they came to rest on the small, silvered daguerreotype of Eleanor that John had placed back on the mantelpiece after showing it to Ayanna. He said something, a quiet question. "He asks," Ayanna translated, "who is the woman who smiles from the silver?" "My wife," John said, his voice quiet. "Eleanor, she is gone." Hastian looked at John, a deep, knowing look in his eyes. He spoke again, his tone softer now. "He says he also has a wife waiting for him," Ayanna said. "He says he has lost a son, to the blue coats, many years ago." And there it was, the common ground, the universal language of loss that needed no translation. John found himself speaking, telling this stranger, through a child from yet another tribe, about his own war. He didn't speak of battles or strategies, but of the deep, aching wound it had left on the land and on its people. He spoke of a nation divided, of good men forced to kill other good men over ideas they barely understood. He spoke of coming home to find his world empty, of seeking a place where the noise of memory could finally grow quiet. Hastian listened, his head bowed slightly. When John was finished, the chief spoke for a long time. "He says his people have also known a war that never ends," Ayanna said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "He says the world is a hard place, full of men who have forgotten that the sky is our father and the earth is our mother. He says a man who shows kindness to a helpless child is a man who has not forgotten. He says you have the heart of a warrior, though you carry no weapons." John felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he barely recognized it. It was pride. It was acceptance. He stood up and went to the water bucket, ladling fresh water into a clean bowl this time. He walked over and offered it to Hastian. The chief took the bowl in both hands. He looked into the clear water, then up at John. He took a long, slow drink. Then, instead of setting it down, he held it out to John. John took the bowl and drank from the same spot, the cool water a balm on his dry throat. They had shared bread, and now they shared water. In the quiet of the small cabin, a treaty had been signed, a pact made between two men who had every reason to be enemies, but had found a shared humanity instead. One of Hastian's warriors murmured something, and Ayanna smiled for the first time that day. "He says you make this land good," she translated. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet dignity of these men, John felt the immense, crushing weight of the last few years begin to lift. The grief, the solitude, the bitterness, it all seemed to recede. He looked at Hastian, a man who had come to kill him and was now sharing his water. He looked at Ayanna, a child who had brought chaos and terror to his door and had ended up bringing him back to life. The sheer, impossible strangeness of it, the profound, unasked-for grace of it, struck him all at once. A laugh, rusty from years of disuse, bubbled up from deep inside him. It turned into a smile. It was not the grim, tight-lipped expression he sometimes wore. It was a real smile, one that broke across his weathered face and lit up his gray eyes, chasing the shadows from their corners. It was the smile of a man who had walked through the valley of death and had, against all reason, come out the other side. Ayanna watched him, her dark eyes wide. She had seen him as a savior, a protector, a figure of immense strength. Now, for the first time, she was seeing the man underneath. She saw the deep sorrow etched into his face momentarily smoothed away, replaced by a light she had never seen there before. She saw the soul of the man who had shown her kindness, and in his smile, she understood the depth of the gift she had unknowingly given him. But she also saw the truth in the eyes of the warriors around her. These were her deliverers. They had come to take her home. Her journey with the quiet farmer was nearing its end. The knowledge was a bittersweet ache, a mixture of joy for his rediscovered peace and the quiet sorrow of a farewell that was now inevitable. Part 7. Farewell under the crimson sky. The sun climbed higher, burning the morning mist off the plains and turning the muddy ground to a steaming, reddish-brown. The air, once thick with tension, was now clear and still. The Navajo warriors had watered their horses at John's trough, a quiet, orderly procession that felt more like a gathering of farmhands than a war party. They moved with an economy of motion, their preparations for departure swift and silent. Inside the cabin, the peace was fragile, laced with the unspoken truth of the coming separation. Hastian, the chief, had finished the last of the water and bread. He stood, his tall frame nearly brushing the low rafters, and gave a formal nod to John. Through Ayanna, he laid out the final piece of the story. "He says they will continue their hunt for the coyotes," she translated, her voice soft. "But first, they must take me north, to the Brazos River. My people, Comanche, they are there. He will see that I am returned." The words, though expected, landed with a heavy finality. John looked at Ayanna. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. There was a light in her eyes, a deep, yearning hope at the thought of seeing her family again. But as her gaze met his, that light was tempered by a profound sadness, a reluctance to break the fragile bond that had been forged between them in fire and fear. John simply nodded. There was nothing else to do. This was always how it was meant to end. She did not belong here, in this lonely world he had built for himself. She belonged with her own people, under her own sky. To wish for anything else would be a selfishness he could not afford. "That is good," he said, his voice steady. "That is right." Hastian gave John a long, searching look. He spoke a final time to Ayanna, his tone carrying the weight of a formal declaration. "He says the story of this day will be told in his lodge," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The story of the lone farmer who did not raise a gun, who gave shelter to an enemy's child. He says your name. John Carter will be known to his people as a man of peace." With that, the chief turned and left the cabin, his warriors following him out into the bright morning sun. The departure had begun. Ayanna lingered for a moment in the sudden emptiness of the room. The space between her and John felt immense, charged with all the things they could not say. There were no shared words for the gratitude she felt, or for the deep protective affection he had discovered within himself. She looked around the small cabin one last time at the hearth where she had found warmth, the cot where she had found rest, the man who had given her safety. Then, she reached for a small leather pouch that was tied to her belt, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep. Her small fingers worked at the knot, and she pulled something out. She stepped forward and held it out to him on her open palm. It was a bracelet, no wider than her thumb. It was intricately woven from tiny beads of polished stone and dyed porcupine quills. The colors were rich and vibrant, a deep sky blue, a fiery red, a strip of stark white, and a zigzag of black. It was a beautiful, delicate thing, a piece of art that seemed impossibly fragile in the context of this harsh, unforgiving land. It looked impossibly small in her hand, and even smaller when he looked at his own large, calloused ones. "For you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at the bracelet, then at her, confused. "I can't take this, child. It's yours." She shook her head, her expression earnest and insistent. She pushed it into his hand, her small fingers closing his larger ones around it. "No," she said. choosing her English words with great care. "You keep." She touched her own chest, over her heart. "My spirit," she said, struggling for the concept. "This is for my spirit, so it does not forget you." He understood. It wasn't just a gift. It was a promise, a symbol, a piece of her soul left behind to stand watch in his solitude. He looked down at the intricate beadwork, at the patient, careful work that had gone into its creation. It felt impossibly heavy in his hand, weighted with a significance he could barely comprehend. He, who had lost everything, was being given a memory, a tangible piece of a bond that had saved him from himself. He fumbled with it, his thick fingers clumsy as he tried to slip it over his hand. It was too small. Ayanna saw his struggle, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. She took his left wrist, the one with the long, healing gash from Silas's knife, and gently worked the bracelet over his hand. It was a tight fit, but it settled on his wrist, a circle of impossible color against his sun-beaten skin. It looked out of place, and yet, in some fundamental way, it looked like it belonged. "Thank you, Ayanna," he said, his voice thick. Outside, a horse was brought for her, a gentle-looking mare. One of the warriors helped her mount. She sat astride the horse, small and straight-backed, looking more like a princess than a refugee. She looked back at John, who had followed her out onto the porch. Their eyes met across the yard. There were no more words to be said. A shared look conveyed it all, the gratitude, the respect, the sorrow of parting. It was a silent, profound farewell. Hastian raised a hand, and the entire party began to move as one. Turning their ponies to the north, they rode out, not with the urgency of a war party, but with the steady, measured pace of men on a long journey home. Ayanna did not look back again. John stood on his porch and watched them go. He watched as they crossed his withered cornfield, a long, dark line of men with a single, small figure in their midst. He watched as they crested the low rise to the north, their silhouettes stark against the bright blue sky. He watched as they descended into the rolling plains beyond, the dust from their horses a faint, golden haze in the morning light. He stood there long after they had become indistinguishable from the shimmering heat on the horizon. He stood there until the dust had settled and the land was once again empty. He stood until the only sounds were the weary groan of his windmill and the vast, profound silence of the prairie. He was alone again. He turned and walked back into his cabin. The silence that met him was different from the one he had cultivated for so many years. The old silence had been a cold, heavy thing. The silence of a tomb, filled with the ghosts of what he had lost. This new silence was different. It was quiet, but it was not empty. It was filled with the echo of her song, the memory of her smile, the ghost of her presence. The small room held the warmth of a life he had touched, and that had touched him in return. The solitude settled back over him like a familiar cloak, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the cold, suffocating shroud of grief. It was just quiet, a space to think, a space to heal. He looked down at his wrist. The bright, intricate bracelet was a shock of color in his monochrome world, a permanent reminder that even in the most desolate of places, connection was possible. His loneliness was no longer an affliction. It was simply a state of being, one that was now imbued with a deep and abiding sense of meaning. He did not sit. He did not brood. The time for that was over. He picked up his worn work gloves from the table and pulled them on. He walked outside, into the heat of the day, his eyes scanning his property. He saw the broken fence rail where Hank had fallen. He saw the deep gouges in the dirt from the horse's hooves. He saw the mess and the disarray left by the storm, both the one in the sky and the one in his life. He went to the stable, retrieved his hammer and a handful of nails. He walked over to the broken fence, picked up the splintered rail, and set to work. The crack of his hammer against the wood was a sharp, clean sound in the stillness. It was the sound of rebuilding, the sound of a man mending his world. He worked through the day, his movements slow, deliberate, and purposeful. He fixed the fence. He cleared the debris from the yard. He drew water for Solomon. He went back to the familiar litany of chores that had once been his only bulwark against despair. But now, they felt different. They were not acts of survival anymore. They were acts of living. Each nail he hammered, each bucket of water he drew, was an affirmation. He was still here. He had a purpose. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in streaks of crimson and gold, he finished his work. He stood by the newly mended fence, leaning against a post, his muscles aching with a good and honest fatigue. He looked out across the land, his land. It was still a harsh and lonely place. The earth was still dry, the corn still withered. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He raised his hand to wipe the sweat from his brow and caught a glimpse of the beaded bracelet on his wrist. Its bright colors seemed to hold the last of the day's light. A lone farmer, standing on his patch of stubborn earth, watching the sun go down. It was the same life he had before, but his soul was new. Part 8, The Farmer and the Wind. The years fell away like leaves in autumn, one season bleeding into the next with the steady, unhurried rhythm of the plains. The sun and the wind were constant sculptors, carving deeper lines into John's face and bleaching the last of the brown from his beard, leaving it the color of sun-scorched river grass. His shoulders stooped a little now, the result of 1,000 days spent bending to the will of the stubborn earth. But his hands, though gnarled and scarred, remained strong. His farm had changed, and yet it had remained the same. The log cabin stood as sturdy as the day he'd built it, the wood now weathered to a soft, silver gray. The windmill still groaned its weary complaint against the sky, a sound so familiar it had become a part of his own heartbeat, the metallic pulse of his solitary life. He had managed, through years of tireless effort, to coax a little more life from the soil. The cornfield was a little larger, the stalks a little greener, and a small patch near the cabin now produced a meager but determined crop of squash and beans. He had even planted a single, stubborn cottonwood tree by the porch, and its slow, patient growth was a quiet testament to his own endurance. He was still alone. No other neighbors had come to test the boundaries of his solitude. The world of men, with its towns and its troubles, remained a distant rumor on the horizon. After the confrontation with Harlow and the arrival of the Navajo, no one had bothered him again. Perhaps the story had been told, a cautionary tale about the quiet farmer who was best left to his own devices, or perhaps, in the vastness of the plains, he had simply been forgotten. He did not mind. The solitude that had once been his prison had, over the years, become his sanctuary. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a silence filled with ghosts, but they were no longer the haunting specters of grief. The memory of Eleanor was a soft, gentle presence, the ache of her loss having faded into a sweet, quiet sorrow. And the memory of Ayanna was a bright, warm thread woven into the fabric of his days. He would see her in the flash of a bluebird's wing, hear her song in the whisper of the wind through the dry corn, feel her presence in the quiet courage it took to face each new day. He never took off the bracelet. It was a permanent part of him now. Its bright colors faded and softened by years of sun and sweat and work. The leather was worn smooth, molded perfectly to the shape of his wrist. It was a strange and beautiful contradiction, a delicate, intricate piece of another world resting on the arm of a man who was as solid and unadorned as the earth he worked. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on his porch and run a thumb over the worn beads, each one a small, smooth stone of memory. He would remember the terror in her eyes, the sound of her voice, the fierce loyalty that had made her step out of the cabin to stand beside him at dawn. The bracelet was more than a keepsake. It was his proof that in a life defined by loss and isolation, A moment of grace had found him, proof that he had been a part of something larger than himself. The years had taught him a new language, the language of the plains. He could read the sky and know when a storm was coming. He could read the tracks in the dust and know what creature had passed in the night. He had become a part of the land. His rhythm synced with the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons. He was an old man, though not yet ancient, and he had found a measure of peace that he had once believed was impossible. It was a day in late autumn, perhaps 10 years after the girl had left. The air was sharp and clear, the sky a vast, aching blue that seemed to stretch into eternity. The last of the corn had been harvested, its golden stalks standing like skeletal sentinels in the field. The cottonwood tree he had planted was a blaze of yellow, its leaves shivering in the cool breeze. It was a day for looking far, a day when the world felt clean and new and full of quiet promise. John was on his porch, mending a piece of leather harness, his movements slow and methodical. He paused to look out at the horizon, his eyes scanning the endless roll of the plains out of habit. And that's when he saw it. To the north, in the direction she had gone, was a wisp of smoke. It was not the thick, billowing cloud of a prairie fire, nor the dirty smudge of a settler's cook fire. It was a thin, almost invisible column of white, rising straight up into the still air before being caught by the higher winds and drawn out into a long, delicate banner. It was precise. It was deliberate. It was a signal. He put down his work, his hands suddenly still. He stood up, his joints protesting with a quiet creak, and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on that distant plume. He had seen smoke signals before, during the war, but they had always been portents of battle, of movement, of death. This felt different. This felt like a word spoken across a great distance, a single, quiet syllable of remembrance. He could not know for sure what it meant. It could be a hunting party. It could be a band of travelers, a camp making its morning fire. It could be nothing at all, a trick of the light, a figment of an old man's lonely imagination. But in his heart, he knew what it was. It was a greeting, a sign from her people, the Comanche, a quiet acknowledgement across the years that the bridge built on that violent, hopeful dawn still stood. It was a whisper on the wind, telling him that he was not forgotten. He did not wave. He did not build a fire of his own in response. He simply stood and watched, his heart full of a quiet, profound joy. He thought of the young girl, who would be a woman now, with a life of her own, perhaps with children of her own. He hoped she was safe. He hoped she was happy. He hoped she still remembered the quiet farmer who had given her a drink of water and a place to rest. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, a smile of deep, settled peace. He looked out at the vast, indifferent land that had taken so much from him, and had, in the end, given him back himself. He thought of the violence and the fear, the hatred of men like Harlow, and the quiet dignity of men like Hastian. He thought of the small, impossible acts of trust that held the world together. He spoke the words aloud, his voice a low whisper that was almost carried away by the wind. Maybe kindness never dies out here. The smoke signal eventually faded, dissolving into the immense blue of the sky until it was gone. But its message remained, imprinted on his soul. He stood for a long time, watching the place where it had been, feeling the warmth of the autumn sun on his shoulders. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place. The coming winter would be cold. The spring planting would be back-breaking work. But something had shifted inside him, a final piece clicking into place. He turned and stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the dry, cracked earth of the yard. He did not walk back to the cabin. Instead, he walked towards his field, towards the setting sun. The light cast his long shadow behind him, a lone figure moving across a vast, empty canvas. The land was harsh. The horizon was empty. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not walking away from anything. He was walking towards something. In the quiet, fertile soil of his own heart, a seed of hope, planted 10 years ago by a lost child, had finally, irrevocably, taken root. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support it by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.